Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
How's everyone doing out there?
Well, thank you.
And
Good, good. Just for the beginning of this, I'm gonna mute everyone from any background noise or anything like that. We are expecting some more folks, but you could feel free to put things in the chat. I saw a couple of folks already responded that they said good morning to me. Hi, Raquel, I see you there. So these are our morning people. Are you all morning folks or this just fitting in your time? You can put in the chat if you will. Some people are morning folks. Good. Well, the staff here are not morning people. So take that how you want. Anyway, welcome, welcome, welcome. Hopefully my colleagues will unmute themselves so they get an opportunity to introduce themselves. But welcome to our second episode in our social justice series called Beyond #Activism. And we'll talk about that in a quick minute. But if you do not know me, I am Rena Doyle. I work for the California Teachers Association. I'm a social justice activist, specifically from the Center of Racial and Social Justice in CTA. And my colleagues with me today are.
good morning, everyone. My name is Gail Watts. I am also a racial and social justice activist employed by the California Teachers Association. I work out of Region 1, where CTA headquarters is located in the Bay Area. And I'm also the statewide organizer for our student CTA program. So those are the college students across the state who are pursuing careers in education. Good morning.
And good morning. I'm Lisa Adams, and I work with Gail and Rena in the Center for Racial and Social Justice. Some of you may be saying, what's that? CTA has a center, formerly known as the Human Rights Department. I'm in Region 4, so those of you who are in Southern California, south of LA, everything south of LA, may know me. Anyway, I'm excited to be here. Not a morning person though, but I'm still excited. Good morning.
So they managed to hire a bunch of non-morning people in our department. That's at least one thing we have in common. But don't worry, as this goes on, you'll see we perk up and we wake up. So those of you who are morning people can keep the enthusiasm going for us in this session. So I already see some people said this is their second Zoom for the morning already. So we'll try to make this pleasant and awesome. We are going until 11:30. And we're going to have some conversations today about activism. And so a lot of you all may be seeing and hearing a lot of conversations around racial justice, especially around the murder of George Floyd. And people are like, wow, we really need to do something. We need to have these conversations and so on and so forth. The problem is a lot of times where it happens is social media, and that's where it stays, right? That activism is secluded to social media in some ways. Now, this is not to talk bad about activism and social media. Social media has proven in this country and other countries to really accelerate and help many causes, positive and negative, but many causes. And so one of the things we want to talk about is, how to avoid just #activism. So you may see people have at the bottom of what they post #BLM or Black Lives Matter. But beyond that, that's it, right? There isn't really an explanation, or it's kind of like the sexy hashtag to do, right? That all of a sudden people are all about Black Lives Matter and may not really understand it. So we're going to talk about that, but we're going to talk about, what gets people activated. We're going to talk about what is activism. We're going to talk about why are people feeling like this. And we're going to give you some opportunity to go into breakout sessions and talk about some of the frustrations you have. And then we're going to talk about what are some things or ideas that you may have of what you can do that are beyond hashtag. And then also we have some ideas for you. So thumbs up. Does that sound good? All right. So I saw someone, Amanda, put, we're at a crossroads moment. Yeah. Some people feel like, look, this is make it or break it. But we also have to remember in this activism that we don't spend a whole lot of time saying we got to do something, I got to do something now, and then we end up making these rash. So all of a sudden, Gail, Lisa, and I are getting all these calls for trainings, right? Because in academia, if we throw a training at it, it will solve all the problems, right? Or if we throw money on it, it'll solve all the problems. And that's not necessarily the case. What we're talking about that Amanda talked about in the Crossroads is really to make systemic change. And that's not going to happen by just throwing trainings at things. Now, that is an oxymoron that you may consider this a training. We consider it sort of a session to talk about social justice, not necessarily a training. So we hope you enjoy. We welcome you, even though we are not morning people. We're happy that people get up and find this important enough to join us this morning. So I want to thank you for your time. So we're going to have conversations together, but we're also going to have conversations in breakout sessions. And I want to sort of set the tone as to the method that we're going to use. And if you've ever done any sessions with us, you know, we do a lot of our sessions in dialogue mode versus discussion mode. Now, some of you all may use those words synonymously, but they are not. They are not synonymous at all. As a matter of fact, it depends on your intent of what you're trying to do. Do you use dialogue mode or do you use discussion mode? So I'm just going to give you a quick synopsis of the difference, and we'd like you to sort of switch your skills into dialogue versus discussion for the purposes of your 90 minutes with us. So if you are in discussion mode, think about that as debate mode. There's certain behaviors that you would participate in debating, that you want to sway a person to go this way or that way, or the group to go to this way or that way, or that we are trying to come to some sort of consensus or vote on something. So you may have this in your life in terms of like maybe your staff agendas or meetings, that we have to come to some consensus. We have to make a decision. And we will not be asking you to do that today. So there will be no need for you to debate with one another. And some of that behavior may look like that you want to agree with someone or you want to disagree with someone, right? And so we ask that you don't use those terms agree or disagree. The minute you say agree, someone is in their head going, well, that's not my experience at all. I disagree. So someone says something that resonates with you or you could relate to, maybe use those words instead of agree or disagree, or the dreaded agree to disagree. So we're in dialogue mode. So in discussion mode, it's more of a debate, and we will not be debating any of the topics. You are relieved and you are not burdened with convincing anyone about your experiences, your perspectives, or anything like that. So you are not burdened there. But dialogue, what is dialogue then? And so dialogue is the behavior and the act of gaining greater understanding, that you want to specifically seek out experiences, ideas, and perspectives about a topic. So there's no need to validate or invalidate or play devil's advocate or any of those things in dialogue mode. Dialogue mode allows us to have a deeper understanding of a topic, to understand the complexity of a topic by exploring the human experiences within that topic. So again, if you're exploring experiences, you're not looking to validate or invalidate. You are also not looking to play devil's advocate. You're not looking to agree or disagree. You're actually exploring those experiences. And that's really important skill to have in social justice. It's sort of the weaving connectivity of all of our series, if you joined us for the last one and if you joined us for this one, right? So dialogue versus discussion, not the same thing. In dialogue, you are not coming to any consensus. In discussion mode, it's a debate. Now, you may see this in social media, right? And the problem is a lot of times in social media, we end up debating social justice issues instead of dialoguing about these issues. So someone will tell you, you are absolutely right or absolutely wrong. And maybe you yourself have put out all this data to prove what you're saying is right. And rarely do we ever listen to the experiences of one another. And that's why sometimes social media is not the best place to have a conversation about social justice issues. It just depends on how it's happening. So any of you all ever get on there and you talk about politics or racism or any of these things and people tell you, no, you're wrong. There's no such thing as racism. Anybody ever have that happen to you? Yeah, I see a couple heads nodding, right? And especially by people who will never experience it. That cracks me up. But that's a debate. And so we're not going to be in debate mode. We are going to be in dialogue mode. We also understand that that if you got on this call, hopefully you are a person that we are not convincing you into activism. That we are going to start from a place of either you want to do some activism, you've been doing some activism, you want to learn more. That's where we're starting from. We are not starting from a place of convincing anybody that activism should be happening at this time, right? So we're a little bit a step up from that. So just so you know, if you want to be convinced in the activism, then this may not be where you're going to get a lot out of it. What you're going to get out of this conversation today is some pitfalls to maneuver out of, and you're also going to get some good perspectives and experiences of your colleagues that are on here. Okay? Sound good? Dialogue versus discussion. Use your dialogue skills. All right, we're going to move on. Gail, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So since dialogue is about creating a deeper understanding, we'd like to create a deeper understanding about this concept of racism, which has been certainly used a lot more both in social media and media in general lately. So in the chat space, I'd like you to post, what do you think is systemic racism in particular? So what are your thoughts about what is this? If you were to describe it, define it, explain it, what is systemic racism? And then I'll read out some of the posts I see. So I see racist ideas that are reinforced through social systems and institutions. Systemic racism favors one race at the expense of others. Policy that causes unequal results among different demographics. Bias that's ingrained. Wow, they're coming up fast now. Unequal application of law and opportunities. The ways in which the system is set up to keep certain races from moving forward or bettering themselves. Systems put into place by government cultures that cause inequity. Working as a gatekeeper of information to oppress others. An institutional process which places one race as superior to others. Systems that are built to benefit one race, bias backed by power. Racism built into society structures that operates in a racist manner without any people who are racist or non-racist present. Yeah, it's amazing how there's so much racism, but nobody's a racist these days. There's a history of racism. It's interwoven into the fabric of our society, government, and communities at every level. Generational laws and acts. A dominant culture who takes over and permeates all aspects of a society, which causes equity and injustice. Racist ideas and behaviors that have become the way things are done in our structures and systems that favor one group of people at the expense of others. Unwritten, unsaid prejudices that are often ignored. So I see that there's actually quite a bit of understanding about what systemic racism is. And so we're going to actually, though, explore this concept a little bit more deeply. And so we have a definition that we'd like to share with you all, because we find that it is used incorrectly so often. Frequently in the media, you'll find that people will individualize racism, meaning that they'll label somebody a racist because they have hate in their heart and they've done something awful. Or we'll say things like, you know, if we just do a better job of screening out racist in policing, then policing will be okay. But the individualizing of racism allows us to miss the ways that it's all around us. Yes, it is actually embedded into the systems and institutions and fabric of our society. Now, in this country, it is a highly organized system of white race group privilege, and that needs to be said. In another country, it may be a different racial group, but here, it is a highly organized system for white privilege. So if you think about how that got embedded into the very, fabric of our society, go all the way back to the founders, right? The economic might of our country was built on the rape, torture, murder, and forced removal of indigenous people, which then made land available that could be sold for a profit. And then African people were kidnapped, murdered, raped, and forced to work this land as people who were enslaved. And many of our founders were, in fact, enslavers. And even those that were not depended upon an economic might of a country that was built in slavery. So what kind of systems would these people create? It's not surprising that they create institutions and systems that worked well for them and people like them. Now you may say, well, but it's been hundreds of years and we've passed all these laws. Yes, we've passed a lot of laws to address inequities, particularly racial inequities, but we haven't redesigned the systems themselves. And so, you'll see on the right side of the screen, these are just a few of the institutions. It's not a complete list, but education is at the top of the screen. Now, when you think about the K through 12 education system, that's something that basically all of us go through, right? But if you think about the racial outcomes, graduation rates, it's higher for white students and some Asian groups. Discipline rates, it's lower for white groups as well as some Asian groups. Placement in AP and Gates classes, it's higher for white students and some Asians. Placement in special ed, it's lower for white students and some Asians. Standardized testing, guess who it's higher for? White students and some Asian populations. And this isn't new. This is, the system has produced these outcomes over and over and over again. And then if you think about, that's just one system, one institution. If we tie that to all of the others and think systemically, then you have to add all of the layers of all of the other institutions in place. So for example, we often talk about, the wage gap for women. Women earn 82 cents to the dollar compared to a white man. But that's an average, right? That doesn't talk about the racial disparities just among a group of women. So of the Black women who actually go on to college, percentage-wise, they're enrolled and graduating with postgraduate degrees at higher rates than any other female racial group. Yet, when you think about job opportunity and income, they're only making 62 cents on the dollar, and as opposed to the average for women at 82 cents on the dollar. Now think about how that impacts one's access to safe and affordable housing, how that impacts one's access to healthcare systems, right? So it's not just one layer, it's over and over again. Black and brown communities tend to be exposed to environmental toxins at much higher rates. There are communities that are policed at much higher rates, so it's not surprising their regular interactions with policing as well as the justice system. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that the people who have the lowest life expectancies in this country are Indigenous people and African Americans at only 75 years. Because it's not just one thing, it's everything. It's an entire system. But so often we want to say, when we look at these data, when you see kind of the dashboard for education and what's going on in your school or in your school district, people want to label the system as broken. Because of these racial inequities. But I'd like to suggest to you that if something's broken, then it's actually doing something it's not designed to do. So if you think about like driving a car, you know that when you press on the brake, it's designed to stop. So if it doesn't stop, it is in fact broken, right? But if we've always had these kinds of racial disparities in every institution in our society throughout the history of our country, then perhaps it's not broken. Perhaps it's actually designed that way. And so there's a quote that we'd like to share. Rena? There it is. That every system is perfectly designed to produce the results it gets. So the outcomes are not accidental or unintentional. They are actually designed into the institutions themselves. So they're not broken, they're built this way. So when we talk about systemic racism, it's because it's built into all of the institutions in our country, and those institutions are all interconnected in a way that support racism throughout the entire culture of our society, right? Oops.
Okay, so before I really talk about this, I want you to just really look at the image that's on the screen. You may or may not have seen this sculpture before. It is part of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is located in Montgomery, Alabama. And just want to read this real quickly from their website. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened to the public in 2018. It's the nation's first memorial dedicated to the legacy of enslaved Black people, people terrorized by lynching, African Americans humiliated by racial segregation and Jim Crow, and people of color burdened with contemporary presumptions of guilt and police violence. And so we use this image to introduce the next concept, and that's the pain of generational racial trauma. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by generational racial trauma? Here's one definition that is based on an article published by the American Psychological Association, the APA. And we'll share a link to this article in the chat box in a moment. So I'll give you a moment to read that definition for yourself. So researchers have studied what they call transgenerational trauma since the 60s. And some of the early studies were based on Holocaust survivors and their children and grandchildren. And throughout the decades, that research was expanded to other racially oppressed groups, Native Americans, African Americans, Cambodian refugees, just to name a few. There's other groups, but those are just a few examples. But outside the research studies, how does generational or transgenerational racial trauma show up today? What does it look like today? So there's one current example that you can see on television. It's a commercial. It's one of those PSA type commercials. This particular one is put out by Procter & Gamble. And it's a commercial about the talk that Black parents have with their children. I'm not talking about the birds and the bees talk, but a different kind of talk. Raise your hand, those of you who have your cameras on, if you know what I mean by the talk. Let's see. Okay, so some of you, now keep your hand up if your parents or your guardians or whoever raised you sat you down and had that talk with you. Raise your hand, keep your hand up, excuse me. All right, so some of you, most of the people that have their hands up are people of color. I just like to note that. And some of you can put your hands down, thank you. Some of you, but most of you know what I'm talking about, and you may have seen this commercial. If not, it's a very powerful commercial. I'm not sure why Procter & Gamble put it out. I mean, everyone's trying to look good now with Black Lives Matter, but nevertheless, it's a good example. So you can find this commercial on YouTube. Just search the talk Procter & Gamble. And so anyway, just a quick description of this commercial. There's reenactments of Black parents having this talk with their parents, with their children, And it's various points in history. There's a scene from the 30s, a scene from the 50s, and then there's a couple of present day scenes. And so one that really resonated with me, really impacted me, is a Black mother talking to her teenage daughter. And she quizzes her daughter about what to do when she gets pulled over by the police. And the daughter says, "Mom," something like, "Mom, that's not going to happen. I'm a good driver." And the mother says, "Hey, this is not about you getting a ticket. This is about you not making it home." And then there's a pause, as if that wasn't deep enough. There's a pause, and it goes on. And the daughter says, "But I'm going to be okay, right?" To which the mother is unable to answer. And so that's really, to me, says a lot. So that's just one example. And it's a very common example. And so this scenario is an example of what researchers term shared stress. And as you can imagine, the conversation is traumatizing and stressful for both the parents and the child. I'm going to read a quote from the article, and this is from Dr. Alfie Breland-Noble. "There's a sense among African Americans and other marginalized people that our stressors are unique to us and not necessarily shared by people outside our groups. So we share stories of our lived experiences that help set the stage for how our loved ones encounter the world. In turn, that can lead to general distrust and insecurity of others outside our racial group." So that's what we mean by generational or transgenerational racial trauma. It impacts many groups, Black and brown people in particular, on a daily basis. And sometimes it's we're aware of it, sometimes we're not, but it just almost becomes part of who you are. So can you imagine feeling constantly unsafe, especially now when every week there's pretty much a news story about the death of a Black person at the hands of law enforcement. And it's usually a Black person who's doing just normal everyday things like sleeping in her bed, at nighttime, enjoying a bowl of ice cream in the living room, and somehow during these normal everyday activities, Black people end up dead at the hands of law enforcement. So can you imagine? I mean, you don't have to imagine, you know how stressful that is. And it's just every week there's a new one. So, and so you can imagine that Black people and brown people in the US are just constantly re-traumatized each time they see these news stories played over and over. And what makes it worse is that there's usually no closure to these stories. We want to find out what's going to happen. Is justice going to be done? But justice is very slow. It takes years to get some of these, cases through the court system, and it's just hanging over the heads. And your students, if you think about this in the context of your students, they've been exposed to these stories. How long have they been out of school? Constantly, and there's no counterpoint to it. Parents are often just as stressed, and just like the mother in the commercial, really no answer to the question from our young people is, am I going to be okay? Before I leave this slide and this concept, there's another clip some of you may have seen, and this is from a family's security camera. It's like a 5-second clip, a young African-American boy, about 10 years old, playing basketball in his driveway in a suburban-looking neighborhood, and a police car drives by, and just without a beat, he hides behind his father's truck. You all seen that commercial? And as soon as the car passes by, he just without a beat starts playing. And I just ask you again, as educators and educational support providers, is this what we want for our Black and brown students? And also take into consideration, when your students go back to school, if they go back to school in the fall, we might be doing this distance learning, just to make sure you double down on your empathy. There's been a lot of stress in the household of all children, but especially I would say Black and brown children during this time off and in this period of unrest in our country. So next slide, please. Okay, so Gail talked earlier about racism as a system and how many white people do not relate to being a racist. Perhaps you have a friend, you're friends with of people of color, your partner is a person of color, however, etc. We have established that if you're not actively fighting to dismantle systemic racism, you're actually supporting systemic racism. This is one of those either or propositions. You're either, you know, on the bus or you're standing in front of the bus, you know, blocking it. So it's not enough to just say you're not a racist. You have to actually be active in dismantling the system. You're all familiar with that concept, right? Okay. So what are some of the ways that Americans, in particular white Americans, support systemic racism, even if they feel no hatred towards people of color and they're actually horrified about stories, either historical stories or current stories about racial oppression in this country? So the first one is silence, which we, you know, Gail spoke about a little bit, touched upon earlier. It's silence. You have to speak out, use your voice, your networks, your sphere of influence to fight against the system of racism, whether it's at a personal level. Perhaps you witness an act of racism in your presence and you disrupt it. However you disrupt it, you pull out your camera, you speak up, you know, you voice your objection, whatever. You don't just silently just watch it. On a larger scale, that can look like, you know, actively protesting or speaking out, educating others, voting or campaigning for candidates that are actively working to dismantle systemic racism, legislation, etc. So do something, say something. There's no just silent witnessing here. The next one, lack of venues to question. And what we mean by this is not questioning certain things, policies, whether it be, you know, policies at your school site or policies, you know, in your community, policies, rules, laws, etc. And not listening when others, like your students or your colleagues of color, question unfair practices or policies. Not lack of venues to question could look like not allowing people from historically oppressed groups the space to talk about the systems of or racism that's impacting them. You know, just that sort of, are you sure that's what he meant when he said that? Oh, you know, maybe they meant this. So just, you know, denying someone else's lived experience is part of this point. The next one, the denial of white privilege and white fragility. Privilege is part of the system of racism that Gail talked about a few slides ago. Privilege is what keeps the system invisible to those who are part of privileged groups. And in our unconscious bias training, we do a lot about white privilege. I'm really we're not doing it justice here because that's not what this training is about. So I'm just giving it a cursory definition. So our maybe the part extension of white privilege is white fragility. So there's a very popular best-selling book out by Robin DiAngelo called White Fragility. Anyone read it or know of it? Okay. So the fragility part of it is maybe the response. Well, white fragility is often the response of white people when they are confronted with their own privilege. And it can look like a lot of things. I mean, there's a bunch of clips that you watch on the news or on social media now of white fragility. But this fragile response that can look like, you know, either getting extraordinarily upset or, you know, defensive or crying. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that it can show up. But this fragile response, one of the problems with it is it often serves to shut down conversations about racism. Okay, just shut down the dialogue. So we can't get past it because, you know, white people are getting upset, so it has to stop. And The next one is that's the way it is mentality. So it's really easily, especially these days with the constant news cycle and stuff on social media, it's really easy to become hopeless and overwhelmed when we think about systemic racism, whether you're part of a privileged group or oppressed group. So, I just say it's important to practice self-care, to surround yourself with friends and loved ones, those that give you energy. Take a break if you need to, but then get back into the fight. We really don't have the luxury of being hopeless. Now, that's not to say, especially for people of color, some of this stress can result in depression and anxiety. So if you need that kind of help, if you need to talk to a mental health professional, that's what you need to do. But what we're talking about is just that sort of, well, racism, it's been around since this country was started. I don't know how we're ever going to do something to solve it. So I'm not going to do anything at all. That's what we're talking about. The next one, cycles of socialized racism. There's this really great essay written by Bobby Harrow called The Cycle of Socialization that we use in our unconscious bias training. It's an essay about a social theory. And basically, just in a nutshell, I can also, we can also get you that article if you're interested, or you can Google it. It was written almost 20 years, but it describes how we're all socialized into the racist system. And it becomes part of our normalized experience. It's so normalized that we often don't question it. Sometimes we don't see it. For example, for some of you, or maybe for some of those people, some people that you may know, these news reports about police brutality and police violence and the death of Black and brown people at the hands of law enforcement, this is, for some of you, this is new information. You might find yourself wondering, like, wow, why is this happening all of a sudden? But for others of us, we know it's been happening for a very long time, for decades. It's just now, for some reason, popular, or it's just our point in history where people are finally realizing it. So for those of you who it just seems like this is happening all of a sudden, this is because you may have been socialized not to see law enforcement as anything but good. You were raised with a quote unquote healthy respect for police. Police are our friends, officer friendly, et cetera, et cetera. For others of us, mostly people of color, were raised with a wariness, a fear of police, or if you came from a different country where, police are, just as corrupt and maybe even more so, you were raised with a fear of the police. So that's just a quick, example of the cycle of socialization. We are socialized to be part of this system, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. And then the last one, and this is a biggie, I'm really not going to be able to do it justice, and this is more of a symptom, not necessarily a support, but it's the concept of internalized racism. And the unconscious bias training, we spend a great deal of time on this, but just a quick definition is what happens when people of color internalize the negative stereotypes that society holds for them. And they internalize these stereotypes, and it impacts their life outcomes, and it impacts their careers, their academic, their earning power, their mental health, social status, all of that. And so it can also lead to hopelessness, or just like this sort of hopelessness, negative acceptance of racism, and that there's nothing that can be done about it. So those are just some examples. Again, just quickly going over these, we could just have a training on each one of these concepts, but we're going to go on to the next slide. Thank you. Gail and Rena, did you have anything that you wanted to add to any of this?
The only thing I wanted to add in white fragility is that white fragility often recenters the conversation on whiteness instead of on the oppression. So I just wanted to add that little piece there.
Thank you.
Gail, do you have anything before I move on?
No, go ahead.
Great. So now you're going to get an opportunity to speak with one another. We're going to put you in breakout rooms, and they are random breakout rooms. So don't wonder why you were put in a room with a particular person. I'm going to put you in, there's about 64 or 5 of you on the call. I'm going to put you in groups of 4. And we're going to give you a couple of questions for you to talk about. You'll have 20 minutes to talk. And this would be a good time. You don't have to, but since you'll be in a group of about 4 people, it might be good for you to have your camera on, to have these conversations in a small group. It's sometimes hard in a small group to have a conversation when someone doesn't have their camera on. If you don't want to have it on, you don't have to, but it is helpful in these conversations. So in the breakout rooms, I'd like for you to take out your phones. See, this is where Gail, Lisa, and I are different than some educators. We like phones in our sessions. So take a picture of this frame. So you have the questions with you.
Or you can be old school and just write it down. That works too.
It doesn't work anymore, Gail. Stop it. Writing doesn't work anymore at all. All right, everyone take a picture, or I'm going to give you a little bit more time to write them down if you need to write them down. And going to put you in breakout rooms of 4. It was supposed to put you in breakout rooms of 4. That's not what it did. So give me 1 second. Oh, I don't want, oh, I see what it did. Okay, sorry. My math, which is never off, was for some reason off today. So here we go. Recreate the rooms. All right, there we go. Some of you all will have 4. Some of you all will have 5 people, just because of the number that there are in. So you have your questions. And I just want to remind you before I put you in your breakout sessions here, would like to remind you that you are in dialogue mode. So again, no need to agree, no need to disagree, and so on and so forth. And just want to go over the questions with you very quickly. I know you can read them on your own, and sometimes when we ask questions, people go, what do you mean by this question? Or what do you mean by that question? And I want you to come up with your own definitions, not that you need a whole bunch of explanations from us. But what is your current level of, it's moving on me on purpose. It's doing this to me on purpose. Anyway, what is your current level of frustration with systemic racism in this country? That could be a big answer for some of you all, just remembering to share the space in your breakout rooms with one another on what is your current level of frustration. So you could do this in a number situation. You could do this by using your vocabulary. However you'd like to do it is up to you. What factor frustrates you the most? There are probably many factors about systemic racism that is frustrating you. Which one you think, at least today, tomorrow you may have a different answer, but today, what is the factor that frustrates you the most? And what can you do about the topics that frustrate you the most? Now, this isn't really for you to say, oh, what am I doing about it, or sharing or showing off and looking for affirmation. What we're thinking about is you can even throw some concepts out there that you've been thinking about, of things that you can do, and maybe you haven't done them yet, or you need some help thinking about how to bring that to fruition. But what do you think are some things as an individual that you could do about some of these topics? And it does not have to be exclusive to education. None of these questions are exclusive to education. It can be, but it's not exclusive to education, right? So you answer them the best way that you know how. You will get 20 minutes, and at the end of 20 minutes, I'll automatically bring you back to the general session. So you don't have to worry about that, but you do have to look at the time in terms of allowing space for everyone to be able to answer if they would like to answer. Okay? Thumbs up? All right, I see thumbs up of those who I could see. So I'm gonna open up and put you in your rooms.